Christine Khariv is a business development manager at DLF, Attorneys at Law, Ukraine. Christine writes eloquently and passionately about Ukraine on LinkedIn and Twitter, exposing Russian falsehoods and advocating for Ukraine's cause. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. It will help other people find the fantastic speakers that we feature. And please do also consider becoming a patron to help support the work that the channel does. Christine, this is a huge pleasure. I've followed you on LinkedIn really since the start of the war. You've been incredibly active there, and you've been an invaluable source of insight and information.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor. Compared to your other guests on the podcast, I feel a bit less, maybe, I don't know, important, significant, but it's an honor to be here. And
absolutely
to be another
not.
Ukrainian voice, maybe.
No, absolutely not. I mean, people on the channel are really judged by what they write and what they say and the quality of their opinions. And in that respect, you are second to none. You're an invaluable source for many of the people who are following this war. So you're absolutely in no way secondary to anybody else on the channel. And I think one of the most interesting comments you made recently, and it's in relation to the events last week, which I think are still extremely raw and very difficult to discuss. But you said it feels like we're going back to the USSR, that this Russian terrorism, the callous indifference shown towards life, is kind of reminiscent of Chernobyl. It's reminiscent of the sort of terrible events that took place throughout the Soviet Union's history, including the Holodomor, the deportations, and so on. Just this sheer brutality and the scale of it. So I'd love for you to sort of unpack that thought and the kind of emotions that it's stimulating.
Well, for me, this thought came because of the cover-up. Like in the Soviet Union, everything always went according to plan. Nothing ever went wrong, and this includes Chernobyl, a tragedy, yeah, as we know. So I wasn't even born back then. But I know the stories, and I know how the tragedy happened on the 26th of April. And on the 1st of May, people had no idea what happened. People in Kyiv region, they had to join those parades for the Labor Day with their kids, because school kids, they participate in this, like they are never asked. That's just how it is. And they brought outside in the sun. It was very sunny those days, and so they had no idea what risks they were exposed to, and there was a massive cover-up. And yes, there's no regard to victims, to casualties, because in the Soviet Union, people, it's just, they are a very cheap commodity. You can always replace them. Yeah, and it was true in the Soviet era. But now I think what Putin doesn't take into account, or maybe he doesn't want to see this, is that this has changed. And Russia is no Soviet Union. And no, they don't have unlimited raw materials and human resources. They don't have that, but they still act as if they do. And yeah, they don't care for victims. Those are just numbers. You know, as we know, the famous saying that one death is a tragedy and millions of deaths is just statistics. And if you can cover them up and no one will find out, then who cares about the flooding in Kakhovka? There's, like, we've seen the video, you know, of this Salto, the self-appointed administrator, saying that there's no sign of high water. And in the background, you can see the water level rising and flooding the administration building. And this is just surreal. And it's like, I don't know, Orwellian. So yeah, and that's why it just reminded me of this, of the massive cover-ups in the USSR.
I mean, not to trivialize it in any way, because we'll come on to the serious implications in a minute, but the sight of that governor in military uniform standing at a window saying that him and his colleagues are driven to work no problem, and they've got 5 meters of water literally out of the window. I mean, that's like a living meme. I mean, propaganda in the Soviet Union had a serious purpose, and that was to get people to believe in an idea and a concept. Propaganda now just seems to simply be about sowing confusion and lies And some of it, as you say in this particular clip, is particularly clumsy and ineffective.
Yeah, well, there's another thing that is different in our times is that we have internet. Yeah, it was much easier to hide everything, to show everything under the rug in the Soviet times. They don't have this luxury anymore because we can basically follow the events live in most cases because people have smartphones and they can record everything. And so this is not that easily done any longer. That's why we have those memes. That's why we have silly, I don't know, some fails when they say one thing and on record and the video shows a different thing. And so they are caught lying live, essentially. And
Another
it
big
doesn't work.
difference. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Another big difference, of course, is that the Soviet Union was not a rule of law society. You know, if you did something the state didn't like, or something happened to you and it wasn't really on the state's agenda, you had no means to gain restitution. There was no sense of justice. And it seems that since the period, since 1991, Ukrainian independence, Ukraine has been steadily moving away from that lack of rule of law and starting to build the infrastructure of civic society. You know, we won't claim that it's perfect. We're not into sort of propaganda here. And I don't think anyone who supports Ukraine has ever claimed it is perfect, but it is on the route to dramatically changing. If you compare where it was to 30 years ago, Russia seems to have not actually made much progress towards being or becoming a rule of law society.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in the USSR we had this, or they had this. Luckily, I don't remember much. The might makes right policy approach, yeah, to everything, to the governance, and it's still the case in Russia. It's more the case. So in the beginning, after the Soviet Union fell, they had some I know budding democracy, some sprouts, but they lost it all, and now they're back to this might makes right. You have power, you decide what's law, what's not law, and who is over the law. And Ukraine, yeah, you're right. I strongly agree with that. We are not perfect. We are far from perfect, but that's why we wanted to join institutions, international institutions, and become a part of the EU, for example, because we felt that this will help expedite this process and help us get there faster. We have a corrupt system that has to be broken down, but it's hard to break down a system when you don't have an alternative, right? It's you have to put something in place of this broken system. You have to replace it with something and not just demolish everything and then be left without nothing. And so this is why we strive to be part of the European community. Yes, it's not perfect either, but we can use the best practices to build our own state, a better state with the rule of law. And yeah, for us, the Revolution of Dignity, as you mentioned, it was about the rule of law. So when we saw those students beaten up, and we saw that we are not going to have an agreement, association agreement with the European Union, it was as if they were trying to deprive us of this right to live in a country that respects laws, and that was our main concern, and that's why we took to the streets.
And I don't know, you know, how young you were when that happened, but it seems to have been a key awakening moment for many people. They, you know, sort of took independence for granted, I think, many people, even the older generation in 91, and certainly those who were born into, you know, the new Ukrainian Republic, assumed that, well, that's it. That's sort of, as they say, the end of history there, and there aren't going to be any problems. However, the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, I think that was the first awakening many people had, that actually this thing was fragile, it could go backwards, there could be a slide back towards that Soviet mindset. And it seems to be a key kind of catalyst that awakened many people into their activism or professional lives in building this civic society infrastructure. Is that similar to you? And what are your experiences of it?
Well, I think the first spark that we had was earlier in 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution, when we said that we don't want a criminal to rule over Ukraine. But Ukrainians tend to have this short political memory, and as you know, probably in a few years we elected that very person we were demonstrating against, which is incredible. My son once asked me, like, why did you elect Yanukovych? This was crazy. I said, well, yeah, it was crazy, but that's just how it is. So that was probably the first moment, but I would say we lost our chance back then. And yes, in 2014, we felt that this might be a pivotal moment when we can either continue on our way to a better country, a more civilized country, or we can fall back into the USSR times with Russia. And we didn't want to be part of Russia. We didn't want to go along with Russia. And yes, and you're right. I think that we were taking freedom for granted and democracy. Maybe we became a bit, I don't know, lazy, just like you could say about the Western world today, that this is something normal, and it seems as if there won't be any other option. Yeah, there aren't any, but there are, and we can see the rise of tyranny all over the world. And now I think with Ukraine, we put this in the spotlight also. So the events in Ukraine are they have much wider implication for the world, for the global development. And if we choose to fight tyranny on the global scale, or put up with it, put a blind eye to it, say that it doesn't concern me, everything is okay in my country.
And one of the key methods of propaganda is to actually convince people that actually everything is the same. Democracy, tyranny, well, it doesn't really make much difference. Rule of law or not, you'll be living the same. It doesn't make any difference to your life. And it seeks to create this kind of apathy. A question I've got that really comes up from the last week's events and the terrorism around the dam, which we'll keep referring back to, is that the Western media seem to fall into that propagandistic trap because they have this nominal idea that they need to be objective, they need to be completely looking at both sides, both sidism, I think it's called there. But that naturally, in some circumstances, seems to fall into the trap of accepting propaganda narratives, because the propaganda is straight out with the lies. In fact, many of those lies are prepared ahead of time, especially where we suspect that the dam event was organized many weeks or even many months in advance. The lies are immediately everywhere, whereas the news media, with the two sides approach, has to wait for absolutely concrete facts before saying anything meaningful. And we see this weakness of the system of lies versus sort of media really on show last week. And it's disastrous, in fact, isn't it?
Well, it feels really insensitive to Ukrainians when you put the version that proposed by Russians, propagated by Russians, and give the same credibility to it as to that of Ukrainians. That just seems extremely insensitive. And I think that, Timothy Snyder has addressed this very well. I recommend everyone to read about this. And yeah, we feel misunderstood. For us, it's obvious, because when you think about a crime like that, which was a crime, the perpetrator would have to have a motive and the means. And this is only true for Russia. We didn't have the means, we didn't have the motives. What did it bring us? So how could you say that we don't know? And have you seen any examples of Ukraine doing anything similar? We have to take the wider context maybe into consideration. Have we seen Russia do such things on the other hand? Well, yes, we have. So yeah, and I think someone put this very well, as that if someone says, like one person says it's raining outside and the other person says it's shining, the sun is shining outside, you don't say, well, it might be shining, the sun might be shining, or maybe it's raining, I don't know. You just stick out your head and see what the truth is. If it's raining or if the sun is shining, and that's it. And there is no need to say, well, this person said the sun was shining, because it's not true. This is not objective. This is giving platform, giving voice to lies and propaganda.
I think as well, I wanted to call out here, I mean, I'm going to cover this later in the week in the sort of news segment that I do as well. The BBC was probably one of the worst sources I'd seen in this event last week. On the day it happened, you had the BBC correspondent on the ground literally saying, well, this has happened, these are the consequences, but we will never know. Not that this is how we might know. He literally said, we will probably never know how this happened. And then that was repeated by the BBC's chief political foreign correspondent, Jeremy Bone, again saying, we will probably never know what happened. This is on day one of the crisis, or the terrorist event. On day two, the Norwegian government released seismic data to show that a massive explosion had taken place, a single massive explosion had taken place, which corroborated many eyewitness accounts. That one, it was an explosion, two, it was a singular explosion. That almost immediately says, first of all, it discounts the propagandistic narrative that the dam crumbled through to age or some mysterious factors, thereby taking agency and intent away from the Russians. Secondly, a single explosion, or a single massive explosion, tells you that wasn't artillery, couldn't have been artillery, and it tells you that Ukraine had no means whatsoever to do it. It also suggests that those explosives would have had to have been placed on the dam itself. Who occupies and controls the dam? Russia does. I mean, this isn't Agatha Christie. You don't have to be Hercule Poirot to work this damn stuff out. And yet, there, day one, BBC is saying, we will never know. Not, this is the kind of evidence we've got. This is the evidence we would need to make a conclusion. Not some sort of balanced and informative point of view, but quite literally a narrative that serves the propagandist, that takes any, absolves the, those who did it from any kind of culpability. So sorry, I'm going a bit of a rant here, but do you see as well in the media and in the LinkedIn, Twitter, places where you are active, do you see these propaganda narratives really winning last week?
Well, first of all, I'm happy I didn't see that report made by a BBC correspondent, because it would have made mistake for sure. I read one headline by Reuters, I believe, who said that Russia and Ukraine blaming each other, and that was enough to just I don't know, not to break my mood, but to send shivers and make me feel a bit helpless and hugely disappointed, of course. So yes, I can see this, and as soon as we have this doubt, even a bit of doubt, a grain of doubt that's sown, Russia can use it to its advantage. And if someone so reputable as BBC says, we will never know, well, then they can speculate it still for years to come, and they might use it next year, or when we discuss reparations and everything, or rebuilding costs. So yes, that I think that so free speech is extremely important, and that is one of the reasons we went to Maidan, in 2014. But letting regimes like that of Putin to use this free speech to manipulate the media, I don't think it's acceptable. I think it's time the media learns how to discern the truth, how to prevent propaganda from sieving through the narrative, the official narratives. If they could say that, let's say, it's hard to conclusively establish, we don't have the proof at the moment, but for sure Russia had the motives and Russia had the means, and the dam was built to withstand a nuclear war, right, during the Soviet times. No, it couldn't crumble. No, it couldn't have been destroyed by Ukrainian artillery. We don't have such weapons. Had we had such weapons, the Kerch Bridge would not be existing any longer, right? And so this is how you put it. You can mention, it's okay, maybe mention the other side, but not give the equal weight to those opinions. Well, that's how I see it.
And I think John Sweeney made a good point. I know you sort of follow him on his comments there and his fantastic recent book. He made the point that recently there was a bridge, a far less durable structure that Ukraine had targeted recently because it was a key point of sort of destroying Russia's capacity to use that bridge and access a piece of land. Now, a bridge is far flimsier than a giant concrete structure, and yet it took many dozens of artillery strikes and even missiles to actually render that structure unusable. And that is a incredibly weak structure compared to a dam. So again, consulting with experts, using a tiny bit of logic and knowledge, prior knowledge, would tell you that these propaganda narratives around the bridge crumbling are ludicrous. But what shocks me is the process of it. We had years of propaganda narratives being created around MH17, the jetliner that was shot down by a Buk missile system. We know the propaganda methods. We know what they do and how they do it. So how on earth does the media fall into it? Now, I'm going to ask you about the Ukrainian media because, Ukrainian media has to be an awful lot sharper, perhaps, than Western media because your survival depends on it. So do you see a big difference between the way these events are covered by, say, Kiev Independent and, the really sort of reputable, incredibly sort of strong Ukrainian media and sort of equivalent Western sources?
Well, yes, in this case, of course, I trust our media more. But the problem here is the outsiders will say that they are biased. And that's why we rely on international media. That's why we need them to learn. It's been a long time, and it's time to learn. Yes, and as you've said, there are those methods, and we know them. One method is just not just proposing an alternate version of what happened, but also maybe giving many of them. Like even in this case, they said, well, those were Ukrainians, but they also said it crumbled on its own. Yeah, you can see here not one version, but already two versions. So which one was it? And their goal here is not to just try to negate what is said, to reject, but also to confuse people. And yes, Ukrainian media are just, I guess we are immune to this. But you can always say that we cannot be impartial because we are reporting events on Ukraine. And I don't think any journalist in Ukraine could ever say, well, any, I don't know, sane journalist could ever say that there's a chance Ukrainians did it. Of course not. That's unthinkable. But I think that it's time for the Western media, international media, to learn from our media as well. And there's a lot to learn.
And another problem, I think, with the media is its short-termism. It might cover a story in the heat of the moment, but then, it drops off. So as awful as it is to say, an event like Bucha and Irpin is the perfect event for the Western media because terrible, tragic events, but there is film footage. You can actually see it, you can show it, it's demonstrable. And the lies that the propagandists put out are relatively easily, dismissed with that evidence. Also, it's a terrible human tragedy, but the longer term consequences are not so great. So you can cover that story in its immediate aftermath, the tragedy, the emotion, the appalling impact in the immediate vicinity. And that's perfectly structured for the media. It's what you said earlier today. Few lives is an incredible tragedy. Millions of lives is not. And the Kharkov dam terrorism, this sort of fits that second one. It's difficult to get the full scale of it. It's difficult to get footage that captures the scale of it. You've got propaganda really pushing very, very hard from the outset. And many of the consequences are immediate with the flooding, but some of those worst consequences are in occupied territories, so you have no footage, no eyewitness accounts that you can easily get to, but also the main consequences are going to be long term. And what I really fear, and I'll ask you the question about this, the real fear is that the real implications of this are going to be a massive impact on agriculture, on industry, on the economy, ecology for many years to come. And the media is just not geared up to cover that kind of long-term unfolding tragedy, within its sort of short-termism, short snippet kind of news cycle.
I think this might be due to the audience that we have now, maybe the short attention span and everything, and people maybe they don't want to think so globally and so many years in advance. Though I would say that it's a bit weird when it comes to this particular tragedy in Kakhovka in Kherson region, because it will have global implication as well. As we know, I don't remember 150 tons or something of oil products spilled into the waters, and so the Dnipro River will be polluted, and the waters will reach the Black Sea eventually, right? So this is not just for Ukraine, this is the whole Black Sea region at least. And this is a huge catastrophe, a huge environmental risk for the planet. And as much as we worry about the climate change and its global implications, and the world seems to be ready to join efforts to fight it, somehow this is not seen as having a global impact. So it's hard for me to grasp, because we have become more globally thinking people on the one hand. Yes, and on the other hand, something that's happening in Ukraine, somehow it's very far away still. It still seems like very far away. Maybe it has to do with this being connected to Russia again, because somehow the international organizations and even activists seem to be tiptoeing around Russia. Whenever something happens and Russia has to do with it, somehow it doesn't get the coverage, right? And it's not shown with the true significance of it is not reflected in the media.
And there's two words that trigger me in particular in the media, and for me there are indicators that particular journalist is not prepared to think, is not prepared to structure their report in a really sort of deep and incisive way. One of those words is escalation. So everything awful that is done to Ukraine it just is. Anytime Ukraine strikes back at Russia, it's labeled escalation. And I think people need to be aware, any journalist that will use the word escalation has not thought about what's really going on. I'm not going to say they are ill-intentioned, but they may well be epically incompetent at their job or a not particularly thoughtful person. But that's one trigger word. The other one, of course, is when they talk about a stalemate, when they talk about the fact that, and again, this is one of the problems, when they use these words, they state it as fact. They don't state it as a complete supposition that goes against the evidence of 14 months of war. When they talk about the war being frozen and Ukraine not being able to make any progress, that is in absolutely sort of stark opposition to the facts, when Ukraine was able to push Russia back from first Kiev region, and then Khariv, and then Kherson, masses of evidence that actually there are periods in this mobile of extreme mobility and success. So those are two kind of trigger words. Have you noticed anything else in the media that sort of makes your blood boil, or do you try to switch off when you see that kind of incompetent reporting?
Well, what I wanted to say is my impression is that there are still a lot of myths about Russia, everything surrounding Russia. There are some primordial fears, and so it would seem as if some people's brains they just like switch off when they hear Russia. They have such a deep visceral fear associated with Russia that they can't think logically. They start to use their emotions, and everything is viewed through this prism of what you said, escalation. And they see Ukraine fighting back, and they imagine nuclear war, apparently. And their brain completely shuts down. You can't have analysis if your brain is in this mode, like totally illogical mode, totally emotional, overcome your, I don't know, the lizard brain, as they say, yeah, the amygdala, and you try to protect yourself, and you just think we need to avoid this at any cost. And yes, Ukraine suffers. Yes, they have to sacrifice, but they should understand that it's for the global good. Somehow, of course, this is very, again, short term, because if we allow this kind of nuclear blackmail to go on, well, anyone can do it, and there will be more maniacs like Putin with blackmail, with nukes, right, to blackmail and to achieve their goals. And so, but they don't think, again, they don't think long term. They are just in this grip of fear, and they stop analyzing. So maybe that explains this, and also this event of the dam being destroyed by Russians. Again, they don't want to trigger Russia, or because they have this nuclear baton that they can this stick that they can wave at any moment. So that's my impression. And I don't know. I think that maybe the lack of courage on their part, and as you said, lack of analysis and fear. Ukrainians are tired of being afraid. We're no longer afraid. We've been threatened with the nukes for so long. We're no longer afraid. We have to live. We have to choose, either we're afraid or we live our lives. And we have made this choice. It's time for the world to do the choice too.
And so you mentioned Timothy Schneider, who wrote an excellent article. We'll put the link in here about media, sort of the trap media falls into and the two-sidesism. And another article that came out last week, which you may not have seen, is by Peter Pomerantsev. And this is another aspect, I think, where not just the media, but almost everyone falls into this. And this is perhaps to be forgiven, because unless you are Russia's neighbor, unless you emerged from the Soviet Union or studied Russian history, in fact, even many people who study Russian history don't really understand this point, I think. And that is the Russian mindset. So we see an event like the Kakhovka Dam, we see others, atrocities, and we try to impose our own framework on them, our own sort of logic. And we try to see meaning in their actions. We try to see strategy in everything they do. But what Peter Pomerantsev points out is that fundamentally, there is something far more atavistic and disturbing going on in the Russian mindset, something masochistic in many ways. And then actually the dam explosion, rather than trying to see sort of endless logic in there and trying to understand, well, you know, they drowned their own troops, how could they have done it, blah, blah, blah. This could be scorched earth. This could not actually be a strategic move, or at least the strategic gains wouldn't seem to justify the action. It could just be something from envy, from the willingness and the desire to inflict pain, and indeed to punish Ukraine because Ukraine won't submit to its control. I mean, you almost have to take it back to a human level and see it almost like a husband who's been spurned and is seeking to take some kind of revenge.
So I would like to mention this, maybe an example of how Russian soldiers behave. As we know, when they withdrew from Kyiv region, people returned to their homes to find their feces, in drawers everywhere, in closets. So there were toilets and everything. They were withdrawing. They knew they couldn't keep this territory any longer. What did they do? They just left their feces everywhere. If they can't have it, they will at least try to spoil it for others. So I think that that's this spiteful mentality, and it could be the scorched earth policy, what happened with the dam. If we can't hold this territory, we will show our might. We will do this just for the sheer reason that we can, that we are able to, and we will show our strength, our might, our power. And we will inflict as much damage as we can, because we cannot control this land anymore. We will have to withdraw in any case later. So yes, I agree on that. I saw the article, but I think I haven't finished it, just started reading. But this is this general mentality. Also, I remember reports, like photographs also from Bucha and other places, where on the walls there were inscriptions: who allowed you Ukrainians or Hohols to live like that? Who allowed you to live better than us? This is not okay. So they are not trying to improve their conditions of living. Instead, they try to demolish everything, probably because it's easier, right? It's so much easier to destroy whatever is good, and then you don't, in comparison, you don't seem to be in such a dire state any longer. So I think that is part of the mentality, and it also fits in with this might makes right strategy, yeah, my approach to life and governance. And also, I wanted to say something, but I just slipped. The culture of violence, yeah, a lot has been spoken about this lately, but it is how the society is arranged in Russia. So whoever is hierarchically, they have to torture their subordinates, basically, yeah. And for them, it's okay, because that's how they show their power. They don't strive for respect; they strive for fear, and that's another thing they inflicted with this catastrophe, among other things.
And it's interesting, this envy, this shock and surprise to see that Ukrainians live materially better than they do. Now, some people will say, well, of course, Russia has sent many troops from the provinces, from outside Moscow and St. Petersburg. So, you know, people from those large cities might not have the same reaction to the material living standards. But this has a curious echo. I mean, anyone watching this channel with any frequency will know that I traveled and lived in Russia in the 1990s. And this is something I heard over and over. For anybody who traveled to the Baltics during the Soviet period, for anyone from Russia who traveled to West Germany, and we know there were very few because, of course, you had to have connections to be allowed to actually leave the country. But some did travel, and they were kind of shocked, and they brought back stories of how the living standards in the vassal states within their empire were actually materially much better off than they were. And that didn't provoke the thought of how can we live that way. It provoked, even at that stage in the 90s, bitterness and resentment. At that point, the Soviet system, the empire, was on its knees, and people weren't thinking about resurrecting it, but they were still talking about, well, what did the empire do for us when all these other people were better off? But again, the other thought that occurs is that they didn't also think that, well, these people created those standards for themselves. The immediate reaction of almost every Russian I spoke to was, and this is people who are in their 30s and above, I mean, younger people didn't really think too much about it. They would immediately say, we gave them everything they had. So rather than looking and trying to understand how have they achieved those living standards, immediately this kind of envious interpretation came in, this slightly sort of bitter and resentful attitude. And I think people have to understand that that is what's playing out now. The envy, bitterness, and resentment causes, in some part, this projection of violence by Russia onto its neighbors.
Yes, I agree with that completely. And as you mentioned, it's like you could say a toxic ex. Yeah, when the wife left this husband, found herself an abusive one. Yeah, who was trying to exploit the wife in any way possible, and then she finds herself someone better and builds this great, wonderful life. And the husband becomes spiteful, and he doesn't want to see this because maybe he still loves her or whatever. Maybe now he hates her because she has built something that he failed to build. And it's easier to destroy her better life than to build his own. Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And there's something also that you mentioned that I think maybe this entitlement, like we gave them, but more like the state gave them. So the USSR maybe gave too much to the provinces when in fact it wasn't the case. But the people, as you say, in Russia, They would think so because they were waiting for someone to come and give the things to them, to build institutions maybe that would provide for, that would build the better living standards and so on. They were not thinking about what can I do? How can I proactively make my life better? And that's what we have in Ukraine. And this is a difference between Ukrainian mentality and Russian mentality. We do have a lot of people who have contracted this Soviet syndrome of entitlement, that the state is supposed to come and give you everything for free, and no one asks where it comes from. Yeah, for free, this mythical creature that's called the state is supposed to provide for you. We have such people still in Ukraine, but most people they have seen the Western way of life because we have been exposed to it, to the way Europe lived. And we have tried to build something similar in Ukraine, and we were taking the initiative. And this is how we are different. And then when Russia comes and says, no, wait, you are living the wrong way. Come on, let's go back to our family. Yeah, the tight family of USSR. We are sickened. We don't want that. That's like a nightmare for Ukrainians.
Yes, it almost makes Russia sound a bit like a cargo cult, if you know that concept, you know, where you repeat a certain behavior and you expect things to be given to you for free without understanding, you know, their provenance and how they came about. Well, I want to, you know, focus the last part of our conversation on Ukraine. It's only fair. Russia gets far too much oxygen and attention. And you're involved in the law. And I think one of the key areas where Ukraine has been able to make progress, and where there is still progress that needs to be made, is in rule of law, is in reform of the judiciary, and in creating a level playing field between, say, sort of, you know, normal businesses and reducing, you know, the power of oligarchs, power and influence. So could you sort of describe your experience of how that progress has been made in creating the foundations of a rule of law society, and what progress still needs to be made in terms of judiciary and other aspects of the legal system?
Oh, there's still a long way ahead of us, but we think that when we become part of this European community, that we will have to introduce the structures similar to theirs, and this way we'll be able to fight this corrupt system. And there have been some reforms. We have some new institutions that help with the judicial system, but I don't feel like there's been enough progress. We have fair courts, but we still have corrupt judges as well. So there's still a lot to do in this regard.
When it comes to corruption, I mean, is that confined to a particular group of people or demographics? Is it people who've brought perhaps a Soviet mindset with them, or is it rather a behavior that is being, you know, inherited from one generation to another? How do you interpret the sort of residual corruption?
So I think it's both. I think in our authorities, we still have those old system, the old system, and we have the people that have been in power, let's say in judiciary or in tax authorities for decades, and so they have not changed, and we will just need to demolish it basically. But like I've said, we will need something in place. Yeah, so we need to get rid of those people. But the problem is that if we get rid of them now, it will all just collapse. Yeah, so we can't do that. I would like to see them all gone, but it's not possible. It's not practically possible. Again, what else you asked? I'm sorry, I forgot about the second part of the question. Yeah, so judiciary, so the other aspect is that yes, this is something we have inherited from the Soviet Union, because people essentially didn't have much ownership, and everything was viewed as common, right? So if you go to work and there are some things at work at your enterprise that you might need, it was normal for people to bring them over. You couldn't buy them because you didn't have the money, or because the things were unavailable. So basically the only way to get a lot of things were to not steal them, but I don't know, expropriate them. Just borrow them from your workplace, for example. Yes, and so this has transferred into our lives now, and we have people who live like that for 50 years. And for them, it's hard to change. And yeah, so we have many people that they oppose corruption only if they do not participate in it. You know, when there's someone else who is corrupt, they strongly oppose to that person, and they will say that they should be fired and so on. But if they could benefit from it, suddenly corruption becomes just this normal practice. So we have both, but luckily I think the younger generation thinks differently, and they have not lived in the Soviet Union, so they don't have this mentality of everything being common. And since it's common, then I can take it.
Another thought occurs as well is the influence of the oligarchs, which even prior to the full-scale war was incredibly powerful and penetrated all sorts of aspects of society. Do you think these reforms and the weakening of the power of oligarchy in Ukraine has actually accelerated during wartime, during the full-scale war?
Yes, in my assessment, yes, it has accelerated. They have less power over what's happening in Ukraine, and it's important to understand that many oligarchs, or maybe those who don't qualify as oligarchs but large important businessmen, they were pro-Russian, as we know. Yeah, they had many connections with Russia, and this has now to change, and maybe their assets will also be frozen and taken away, seized for the needs of the state. So yes, this has to change, and I think that after the war, we have this one war now going on with an external enemy, so to speak, but we also have an internal one, and this war has to be fought already, but also after the war, that will be our huge task to fight this internal enemy, because we paid a huge price, and we have to remember that, and we have to remember that we will be held accountable also to how we transform our country. So this is something now and for the future as well.
And I guess the sort of the two more questions here, but let's remain on economics for this one. And I think the other thing people fail to understand is that a corrupt system doesn't just exist by accident. It exists because somebody benefits from it. So even if the 99.9% of people are disadvantaged in a corrupt and nepotistic system, there are enough powerful people who do benefit, who can keep those rules in place. With the rise of the need to reconstruct Ukraine, that's going to require much tighter financial and legal frameworks as a huge influx of money comes in, and will indeed, I think, be demanded by those who are investing the money into Ukraine. So that's one tendency where vast amounts of money may force further improvements. Another area is bureaucracy, because along with corruption, intense bureaucracy obviously is a challenge in many countries, but in Ukraine as well. And there is the rise of the tech industry in Ukraine. Ukraine has become one of the, probably at the forefront in Europe, along with London, as being one of the major drivers of tech and innovation in Europe. And again, that will bring vast amounts of money. Now, tech doesn't necessarily need lots of legal framework. That comes later. What innovation requires is not to be held back by bureaucracy and slowness and so on. So do you think the money that's going to be flowing into Ukraine and generated in Ukraine in future years will actually have quite a powerful impact in reducing corruption, nepotism, and bureaucracy?
Well, yeah, that's the hope. And I think that money that comes into Ukraine, be it from private investors or institutions, they should come at the conditions, yes, and transparently, that everything goes. You can track them completely, and guarantees from the state, and so on. Yeah, so there has to be accountability. I want money to start flowing into Ukraine. I want Ukraine to be rebuilt, but I want it to be built back better. And so the money doesn't end up somewhere where it shouldn't. And yes, I think digitalization is the way to go. And it's a great thing that we have the support that it's being led by the government. First it was the digital transformation ministry. Now we have Mikhailo Fedorov. He became a VP for digital transformation. And so this is this is also coming from the top, yeah, and this gives me hope that there won't be this hurdles of like bureaucracies and legal hurdles on the way to implementing the digitalization, and removing the intermediary, removing the bureaucrat sitting there and the bottleneck, being the bottleneck essentially. So I see this as a huge potential for Ukraine to improve, well, everything, the situation with corruption, and building a better investment climate.
And the last question will again focus on the post-war situation. I mean, the assumption here is Ukraine's going to win. I think everyone who watches this channel, apart from the trolls, has that strong belief. But not just building back better, but building back in humane fashion, I think, is important. And I'd love to hear your views. You know, when the war is finished and Russia is vanquished, there are going to be tens of thousands, if not more, people who have physical trauma. There are going to be many hundreds of thousands, both military and civilian personnel, who have mental trauma. And in fact, every single Ukrainian is dealing with levels of stress which are alien to peaceful societies, whether they've had to go abroad as refugees or whether they've remained in country. There's this huge collective trauma. How effective do you think Ukraine and Ukrainians are going to be in dealing humanely with those problems?
Well, I think this is something new for us, relatively new, and our cities will have to be rebuilt, and they have to be rebuilt to be accessible for people with disabilities. Because if you've ever been to Ukraine before, you would notice that we don't have handicapped people anywhere to be seen, right? Because there are no conditions for them to participate in this everyday life. But they are mostly just sitting at home. They have no way of accessing or anything, yes, in our country. So this has to be taken into account. And I've seen some great initiatives, including by our First Lady, the accessibility program. So this is being under development. Also, I remember a feedback from some refugees, Ukrainian refugees from Mariupol, who went to Warsaw. And the first thing that they mentioned that struck them in Warsaw, that everything was, that the city was really, catered to the needs of people with disabilities. Yeah, so they could access everything. They could go anywhere. And so this has to be implemented in Ukraine everywhere, because we will have those with physical disabilities. And we do have a stigma in Ukraine related to mental illnesses. We don't consider it normal to get help, mental help, or any kind of help for that matter. Ukrainians are raised to be, mostly brought up to be self-dependent. Asking for help is being frowned upon. This was like a huge change, a huge challenge for me to ask for help from strangers and to accept this help. And so we have to work on this. But I can see a lot of programs again underway. I know some programs, for example, rehabilitation through working with horses, so equine assisted therapy for veterans, for people with the PTSD, and also such things as horticulture, therapeutic horticulture, and well, painting and other therapies, or even like calligraphy. Yes, so we have those programs in place. We have to learn from the world. We have to implement the best practices worldwide. But I think by this point, our psychiatrists, our psychologists also have this unique experience, and we can export that to the world as well. So yeah, we have a lot to work on, and we have to make our people more sensitive. We have to speak with our kids on how to respond to people with needs, people who are different. We have to help everyone who returns from this war to socialize and be able to lead a normal life.
Well, Christine, we've come to the end of the time. It's been a huge pleasure speaking to you, and I think we've covered a lot of topics which we haven't covered anywhere else in the channel. So this is I think a hugely interesting sort of episode. I'm so glad you could share your expertise with us. And I encourage everybody to follow you on LinkedIn and see the really interesting stuff you post and repost. But yeah, all I want to say is thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you for having me, and I hope I brought some value to your listeners. And Heroyam Slava, and yeah, hope soon we'll be able to celebrate our victory, joint victory.